dust of war had settled. But for Gall, the warrior of the greasy grass, a new storm was rising. This time, it would not be fought on horseback, but across council fires, behind agency doors, and within the hearts of a people searching for direction. A pen would carry more weight than a rifle, a handshake more danger than a blade. In this episode, we journey into a forgotten chapter of the Lakota struggle, one where survival required more than courage. It demanded transformation. What does a warrior become when there are no more battles to win? This is Chronicles of the Old West, Episode 7 on the life of Gall, Lakota War Chief.
It was in the summer of 1881 that Gall came to Standing Rock, riding not with war paint or feathers, but in the long shadow of surrender. He had crossed the border not in defeat, but in understanding. He had seen what others would not, that the world of the Lakota had changed, and that survival now lay not on horseback, but in patience and labor. The Missouri River flowed slow and wide like memory itself, and there beside its banks rose the agency at Fort Yates. A stone formation stood there, old as the earth. Standing Rock, they called it, shaped like a woman bearing a child. The people said she was still waiting for her husband to return. Perhaps all of them were. The land was crowded now. Some 1,500 Yanktonais camped upriver near the Cannonball, 700 Blackfoot Lakotas, and another 1,500 Hunkpapas. Many of them recent exiles, like Gall, clung to the river's edge. Their teepees clustered like willows. They waited for rations. They waited for orders. They waited for something they could not name. Gall stood among them, tall and silent. The wind moved through the agency camps with the same quiet strength that once moved through the high ridges of the rosebud and the greasy grass. But now the sound was not of war cries or the thunder of ponies. It was the scrape of hoes against dry soil, the creak of wooden carts, the rustle of worn calico shirts, and the distant cough of hungry children. The warrior they called Peasy stood not with a rifle in his hands, but with sleeves rolled to the elbow, the sun darkening his broad back as he bent low over a garden plot carved out of the river-bottom clay. He turned the earth slowly, methodically, as if breaking ground in a place where his people's spirits still walked. His presence was felt like the drumbeat in a ghost dance. Where once he had ridden at the front of a war party, his strength now showed itself in stillness. It was a new kind of battle, not against bluecoats or scouts, but against futility, against forgetting, against the slow erosion of a people's will. And then, 3 moons after Gall's return to Standing Rock, a different kind of man arrived, carried not on horseback, but by the riverboat Sherman, which came wheezing and huffing up the Missouri like some great iron-bellied spirit from the east. From its decks stepped a man who was not a soldier, though the people called him Major. His name was James McLaughlin. His title was honorary, but his influence would become real enough. He was small in stature, no taller than the shoulder of a Lakota boy, but he carried himself as if the earth itself answered to his direction. His posture was stiff as a rifle barrel, his voice clipped and sure, his hair jet black, neatly parted, a sharp goatee drawn across his chin like a black slash. The people watched him with wary eyes. He was not like the army men who shouted orders and pointed guns. No, McLaughlin spoke in legal terms, in ledgers and parcels, in quotas and appointments. He came wrapped not in a uniform, but in authority, a different kind of weapon. The old ones said his eyes could see through a man's soul, and as the winters passed and the frost gathered in his beard, they called him Pehi Ska, white hair. McLaughlin had come from Devil's Lake, a place where the Dakota lived under his rule for 10 years. There, he had learned to play chiefs against one another, like pieces on a game board. He understood not only Indian politics, but Indian hearts, and how to bend them without breaking them. He said he liked the Lakota. He said it with a smile in the meetings, and he would say it again many years later in his book, My Friend, the Indian. But those who listened closely heard something else in his voice, something harder than friendship, a love of control. For McLaughlin, affection was measured in obedience. Respect was earned by submission. And into this strange dance stepped Gall. Gall, who had once stood bare-chested before the cannon mouths at Fort Rice, his wounds exposed to prove his defiance. Gall, who had once led the charge that broke Custer's line and cracked the legend of the U.S. Army in a single afternoon. He was now face to face with a man who carried no rifle, no sword, only a pen, a ledger book, and the power of Washington behind him. This was not the kind of enemy Gall had known in the days of fighting, but it was an enemy nonetheless, or perhaps something more dangerous, an ally who could not be trusted. They met first in silence with cautious eyes and slow words. McLaughlin saw in Gall the perfect image of what he wanted the Lakota to become: strong, respected, yet willing to work, to farm, to adapt. A man of influence who could be shaped and placed before Washington as proof that the Indian problem was not a problem at all, but a solution waiting for discipline. Gall, for his part, saw in McLaughlin a force he could not overpower with bravery or bullets. This man spoke in policies. He drew lines with ink that did not wash away. He smiled, but behind that smile was a trap. Not the kind that snapped bone, but the kind that buried memory. Still, Gall did not turn away. He had come to Standing Rock not to fight again, but to survive. He had come not for himself, but for the children who followed behind him, thin-legged and wide-eyed, their futures trembling like flame. He still bore the wounds of war, some beneath the skin, others deep within the spirit. But in McLaughlin, he saw a chance, not for freedom, but for something else, a foothold in this new world that had come roaring across the plains like a flood. And so, warrior and agent began their slow circle around each other, two strong men, each believing they could shape the other. Gall would take the hoe. McLaughlin would offer a title. Gall would give his labor. McLaughlin would give him a position. But beneath each exchange was a deeper negotiation, one that would echo through every acre of plowed earth, every ration handed out at Fort Yates, and every child sent to the mission school. It was no longer a war of bullets and horses. It was a war of meaning, and Gall, the old war chief, had chosen to fight it on the inside. McLaughlin believed in assimilation, not peace, assimilation, the melting down of one people into another. He came with the voice of the Mohonk reformers, those Eastern men who wore fine coats and no feathers. They believed the Indian must become a Christian, a farmer, a property owner. They said the Indian must plow and pray, that he must cut his hair, take one wife, and forget the drums that once echoed across the plains. Some among the Lakota stood as mountains against the wind, unyielding, their hearts aflame with the old fires of defiance. They would not bend nor bow, for the ways of their fathers were sacred and eternal. Yet others, like Gall, listened with a silence deeper than the rivers, not because their eyes were blind or their spirits broken, but because they saw beyond the horizon where the world was shifting beneath their feet. The great buffalo, once the lifeblood of the plains, had disappeared into the endless sky, leaving only memories and empty trails. The rolling hills that had cradled countless generations were now marked by fences, barriers that cut through the sacred earth. The treaties, those fragile promises once spoken in good faith, had vanished like smoke carried off by the restless wind, leaving behind only questions and sorrow. Gall had met the coming storm with fire and fury, his warrior heart rising against the darkness that threatened to swallow all. He had fought fiercely for the old way, with the thunder of his war cry echoing across the plains, wielding courage as his shield. But now, the battle was different. Quiet as the growing dawn, steady as the slow turning of the seasons. The weapon he took was no longer the tomahawk or the rifle, but the humble hoe in his hand and a fierce, unyielding will burning in his chest. He knew this fight was for the future of his people, not for the world that was passing, but for the world that must be born anew from its ashes. McLaughlin saw this too. He saw in Gall not a puppet to be controlled, but a leader who could stand tall between two worlds, one foot in the old ways, one in the new. Gall was chosen as a bridge, a living example that could carry his people forward through the uncertain twilight, guiding them with strength, honor, and hope. And so, Gall took this burden upon himself, not with the loud roar of battle, but with the quiet power of one who understands that sometimes the greatest courage lies in acceptance, in change, and in the promise of what is yet to come. By 1883, Gall had become a district farmer, earning $10 a month. He worked land near Oak Creek, where the soil was black and good. He raised potatoes, oats, squash. He built a cabin. He worked without complaint. And others followed. Some called him a traitor. Others called him wise. The truth lies somewhere in between. He worked not for McLaughlin, but for the Oyate, the people, for their hunger, for their children. He even served on the Court of Indian Offenses, appointed in 1889 as one of 3 judges. He wore a dark blue coat now. His hair, once tossed in the wind, was neatly combed. When the women gathered at Fort Yates on ration days and played cards to ease their burdens, Gall ruled gently. He knew the importance of rest, of small joys, even within the white man's rules. He judged not with anger, but with dignity. One man said, "There is no justice in any court of the United States that could give you the limit with more solemn dignity than Chief Gall." He had changed, but had not forgotten. He hunted still. In 1882, Gall led a great buffalo hunt west of Fort Yates. Nearly 5,000 buffalo fell that summer. And when two Lakota factions began to quarrel, guns raised and words sharp, it was Gall who stepped between them. He seized their rifles. He would not return them until peace was made. He was no longer just a warrior. He was a peacemaker, and he knew what peace would cost. When Sitting Bull was brought to Standing Rock in the year of 1883, the paths of the two warriors crossed once again beneath a sky heavy with memories. The old chief, once the mighty leader who had guided Gall and their people through exile and shadow, returned now broken in spirit, bitter and blind to the harsh new laws of the agency that sought to bind them. He had been promised the honor of chief of the agency, but when the day came, McLaughlin offered him nothing but 12 acres of earth and a hoe, meager tools for a man whose heart had once roared across the plains. Sitting Bull, proud and fierce, did not bend to these small gifts, nor to the cage of broken promises. His spirit resisted, unyielding and raw. And in this resistance, McLaughlin's bitterness grew like a dark fire within him. So he lifted Gall instead. He sent Gall far from the rolling hills of home, first to New Orleans, a city of strange faces and unfamiliar ways, then to Bismarck, and even to the anniversary of the battle at Little Bighorn. There, among white men dressed in their finest clothes, Gall was praised as the civilized Indian, lauded for his quiet strength and his willingness to walk the narrow path laid before him. They spoke of him as the man who had defeated Custer, the true hero of the plains, the symbol of a new era. But in their words, they forgot the sun that had once shone equally upon both Gall and Sitting Bull. They forgot the blood they had shed side by side for the same people, for the same land, for the same sacred promise that could never be broken. And though the world sought to divide them between the proud chief who refused to bow and the warrior who chose a different fight, Gall carried their shared story within him, a story of struggle, of loss, and of an unbreakable bond that neither time nor men could sever. Some say Gall spoke too freely at that anniversary, that he claimed the glory for himself, that he mocked the Crow Scout Curly as a coward, that he called Sitting Bull a man of shadows. Whether true or not, the words stuck. McLaughlin continued to promote him. He even encouraged Gall's conversion to Christianity, and when Gall was finally baptized in 1892, the missionaries gave him a seat by the stove on Christmas Eve, the warmth of wine in his belly. He joked to the priest, "Now I see why Christians do this every Sunday." He had changed, yes, but not lost himself. He still walked in both worlds. Gall would go on to raise cattle, to judge disputes, to mediate between angry hands and the white law. He even dressed in suits now, his frame grown wide with age and health, his barrel chest still proud, but he remained Lakota. When the bells rang at the mission, he would enter quietly and sit at the back. When his daughters sang the hymns, he listened. But when the winds carried the old songs over the river, he listened to those too. He had walked through fire, through hunger, through exile. And now, as the white man built fences and carved the land into farms, Gall stood among them, changed. He was no longer the warrior they once feared, but he was the leader his people now needed. It was the year 1882. A commission came up the river that year. The lead man was Newton Edmonds, a name known to the old ones, for he had come once before to parley and promise. He had been governor, and now he came again, with two others, Peter Shannon and James Teller. Their mission was partition. The whites wanted land, and they had sent these men to break the earth once more. Their plan was to divide the Great Sioux Reservation into 6 smaller ones: Standing Rock, Cheyenne River, Pine Ridge, Rosebud, Lower Brule, and Crow Creek. Each agency would become its own small world. No more shared lands, no more one people. The white men said this would bring order, but the people knew better. The settlers came like grasshoppers. Since the Black Hills had been taken in 1876, more and more wagons had crossed the Missouri, spilling farmers into the prairies. By 1880, over 117,000 settlers pressed in from the east. The gold seekers in the Black Hills were many more, and all of them wanted land, not just to walk on, but to own. The Edmonds Commission came with promises stacked like bundles of trade goods. They said there would be security, no more soldiers pushing people from their lodges in the dead of night. They said there would be bulls to plow the land, cows for milk, tools to turn the prairie into fields. They said each tribe, Standing Rock, Cheyenne River, Rosebud, and the rest, would have its own reservation, land set aside like a bowl of water kept from the heat. They said the old quarrels over shared hunting grounds would fade away. They spoke with practiced voices, with soft hands that had never gutted a buffalo or held the reins of a war pony. And what they said, on its surface, sounded calm, clean, logical, but beneath it was something sharp. What they did not say, but what every Lakota warrior and grandmother knew in the bone, was that this was only the beginning. These lines they drew on maps were not borders of protection. They were cracks in the sacred hoop, and the more cracks that formed, the easier it would be for the land to fall away. The land not allotted to Indians would not remain wild or empty. It would be sold, opened to settlers who had never sung to the buffalo or buried their kin beneath cottonwoods. Homesteaders would come with barbed wire and court deeds, and what had once been walked by spirits would be fenced and claimed. And each new fence would speak the same message: this is not yours anymore. The circle was being broken, not with gunpowder, but with ink. And yet, Gall listened. He did not listen because he believed the white men's promises. He had seen too many broken treaties to put faith in paper, and he knew their hunger would not stop at any river or ridge. But Gall had always been a man who saw clearly, even in the smoke. He looked across the camps and saw the eyes of his people, tired, anxious, lean from too many winters without enough meat. He heard the coughs of children, the empty laughter of men who no longer had horses to ride or battles to fight. He saw that the wind had changed. The old world of buffalo herds like thunder, of teepee circles unbroken, of freedom from dawn to dusk. That world was not coming back. The rivers still ran, the stars still turned, but the rhythm had shifted. And Gall, warrior of the plains, now stood at the edge of a different kind of fight. The Hunkpapas were slow to speak. They remembered too well. They had stood longest against the Wasatch tide, and their pride was as deep as the Missouri. They did not trust the Commission's words, nor the agency's smiles. The camps murmured with confusion and fear. Some believed this was the final betrayal. Others simply did not know what to think. The presence of the commission stirred old pain and new panic. The people gathered in circles late into the night, listening to the elders, waiting for signs, watching the clouds as if the wind might speak. But Gall did not wait for signs in the sky. He sat with John Grass, Mad Bear, and Big Head, men McLaughlin had quietly begun to shape into leaders for this new time. Men who could speak both languages. Men who understood the world of the agency, with its rules, its rations, and its records. Men who had not forgotten the old ways, but who had learned how to walk inside the new ones without stumbling. On November 30th, 1882, Gall took up the pen. He signed the agreement. He did not sign it with joy. He did not sign it with pride. He signed it because he believed the time for choosing had come, and that choosing meant preserving what could still be saved. He had not stopped being a warrior. He had only changed the shape of his shield. And in that moment, the storm deepened. At the same time, another shadow moved across the reservation. Brave Bear, a Yanktonai who had once followed Sitting Bull into exile. His story was one of blood and betrayal. Accused of a killing long ago in Pembina County, he had fled north, then returned, only to be accused again, this time of killing a white man who had once called him friend. McLaughlin, now the Indian agent at Standing Rock, tried to save Brave Bear. So did Bishop Martin Marty. They believed his brief encounter with the Catholic faith had not yet touched his soul, but might if given time. They pleaded for his sentence to be reduced. They failed. On November 15th, 1882, Brave Bear was hanged. His death shook the reservation. Many Lakota believed this violated the promises made at Sitting Bull's surrender. It deepened mistrust. It poisoned the atmosphere around the Edmunds Plan. And it told the people once again, the Wasatch hand does not forget how to tighten into a fist. And yet, the white men pushed on. They wanted signatures, but the Treaty of Fort Laramie, signed in 1868, had required that 3/4 of all adult Lakota males must agree to any land cession. The Edmunds Commission ignored this, so the Senate refused to ratify the agreement. Instead, a new man came to investigate, Senator Henry Dawes, who believed more than anything in making Indians into farmers, into citizens. His ideas would soon become law, but not yet. At a hearing in August 1883, leaders spoke. Gall, John Grass, Running Antelope, even Sitting Bull, who opposed everything the commission stood for. Gall, once a signer of the Edmunds Plan, now hesitated. Perhaps the smell of betrayal had grown too strong. The following years brought a deeper storm. In 1887, Dawes' vision became law. The General Allotment Act, the Dawes Act, divided tribal lands into 160-acre parcels. It promised citizenship to those who accepted. But the surplus land, that which was not allotted, would be sold to settlers. What had once been Lakota land would now be sold piece by piece to strangers. And the Lakota would become, in the eyes of the government, no longer a nation, but farmers, individuals, bound by paper. Gall saw this, and he saw its danger. Then came the next push, the Sioux Bill of 1888, which sought to shrink the reservation even further. Only 50 cents per acre would be paid for surplus lands. To persuade the Lakota, the government sent the Pratt Commission, led by Captain Richard Pratt, the same man who had built the Carlisle Indian School with the motto, "Kill the Indian, save the man." He came now to take the land. At Standing Rock, Gall was among the first to speak. He remembered the lies of the past. He remembered Fort Laramie. He told the commissioners, "You speak to us as children. You might as well say, 'Gall, you are a bad man.'" Still, they came. They promised cows, tools, seeds, but what they wanted was land. Week after week, they pressured the Lakota to sign. Gall, like many, grew impatient. He told the commission, "We have spoken to you pleasantly, and we have much to do. We are going home today." The bill failed. The people refused to sign. Only 22 signatures were gathered, not even close to the required 3/4. But the government would not stop. In 1889, they sent a new commission, the Crook Commission, named for General George Crook, once an enemy in battle, now a tool of policy. At first, Gall and John Grass stood firm. They had spoken once before, when the Edmunds Commission came up the river, when the promises were still fresh and the betrayal not yet written. They had signed then, hoping to protect what they could. But now, with the Sioux Bill of 1889, the government came again, not with new wisdom, but with a new price. They offered $1.25 per acre. To some, it seemed like a step forward. It was more than the 50 cents first promised. To others, it was a small mask on a large theft. No price could be fair for land that had held the bones of their ancestors, the trails of the buffalo, the songs of their children. But hunger and hardship press on a man's back like stones in a pouch. For many, the sound of coins was beginning to outweigh the sound of drums. And then, in the dusk, behind the fires, McLaughlin came again. He had long favored Gall ever since those early days at Standing Rock, when the warrior had laid down his rifle and picked up the hoe. McLaughlin had praised him in letters and meetings, sent him east to speak, lifted him up as a model to white reformers and missionary men. He called him a progressive chief, a man who had stepped into the white man's world and stood tall within it. But now, McLaughlin turned that favor into pressure. He met first with John Grass under the veil of night in a quiet building near the edge of the agency. With only the interpreter, Louis Primeau, beside him, he spoke plainly. He told Grass that this offer, this price, these promises were the best the Lakota would get. Refuse, and the next plan would be worse. The government would come again, with fewer cattle, with less money, with less mercy. Grass saw the trap. He did not like it, but he recognized it, and so he agreed. Then McLaughlin turned to Gall. The two men had known each other for years. McLaughlin had called Gall stout-hearted, had praised his judgment in the agency reports. Now he came with none of that warmth. He came like a man placing the final stone upon a grave. He said, "Take the deal. Help your people. If not, others will sign without you, and the worst of it will fall on those who followed you." Gall hesitated. Some say he feared the wrath of Sitting Bull, who stood in full opposition and whose tongue still held the fire of an old warrior. Others say Gall had long stopped fearing men and was instead watching something deeper, the horizon itself and the shape of things to come. He remembered the treaties. He remembered the betrayals. He remembered the cold and the hunger, the thin cries of children in the night. And maybe, in that moment, he knew that the hoop would break with or without him. But perhaps, if he stood at the center, he could shape how it broke. And so, Gall stood before the people. Not as a war chief, not with feathers in his hair or blood on his hands. He stood in agency clothes, his face marked by years of labor and loss. And he spoke not with thunder, but with the voice of a man who had borne the storm. He said, the bill must be accepted, that the time had come to take what could be taken before the rest was stripped away. He did not speak for glory. He did not speak to please McLaughlin. He spoke to keep his people from drowning in a tide that no spear could pierce, and many followed. At Standing Rock, 803 Lakotas signed in favor of the bill. Only 5 Hunkpapas and 8 Blackfoot Lakotas voted against it. The agency, once strong in its resistance, had shifted like snow under weight. Sitting Bull, who had once ridden beside Gall into many battles, now stood apart, alone. He watched as his old friend gave his voice to the Wasatch Plan. He watched as the people nodded and stepped forward, one by one, to place their marks on a document that would open their lands to settlers and forever change the shape of their world. And in his sorrow, Sitting Bull said, "There are no Indians left but me." The words were not only bitter, they were heavy, like a stone laid upon a memory. And so it was that the great Sioux reservation was broken, not by war, but by weary hands and worn-out hope. And Gall, who had once shattered Custer's line with a cry and a charge, was now one of the men who helped divide what had been whole, not with joy, not for profit, but out of a grim resolve to do what was necessary, to choose the path still open, to hold on to what could be saved, even as so much was being lost. He was chosen once more to go to Washington, to speak with the Secretary of the Interior, to bargain for the promises made by the Crook Commission. He walked the marble halls of power now. He sat at tables with men in coats and silver buttons. He spoke of schools, of beef rations, of mills, of dances. But back home at Standing Rock, the songs were low and the hearts were heavy. The bill had passed, the land had been divided, the ink had dried, and with it the dreams of many. But no herds of cattle arrived, no mountains of flour or sacks of seed came pouring in. The promises that had been spoken with such urgency during the negotiations now drifted like smoke in the cold wind. The winters were harsh, long, white, and unforgiving. The children shivered under thin blankets. The elders coughed blood into their hands. The meat rations were never enough. The crops withered in soil that once bloomed beneath buffalo hooves, but now groaned under the plow. Diseases came, as they always did, when the land was sick and the spirits restless. Measles, consumption, fevers that spread like whispers between lodges. Graves multiplied, and the sound of mourning became as common as the wind. The promises, made in polished rooms with handshakes and government seals, arrived slow, and sometimes not at all. Tools rusted before they were distributed. The cattle were lean and few. The fences meant to protect the land now hemmed it in like a corral. And the people began to ask whether the price they had paid had been too high. And through it all, Gall stood tall, not with banners, not with glory, but with the quiet strength of a man who had tasted every bitterness and still walked forward. He rose each day before the sun and worked his land, greeted his neighbors, mediated disputes, spoke when asked, listened when not. He stood not because he had won. There was no victory in what had happened. There was only survival. He stood because he had chosen, once again, to carry the burden of his people, to take upon his own shoulders the weight of decisions no man should be forced to make, to stand between the hunger and the hopelessness, to speak not with fire, but with steadiness. Some whispered that he had gone too far, that he had surrendered too much, that he had walked too deeply into the world of the white man and had not brought enough back. But others saw him for what he was, not a warrior of the past, but a father of what remained. He had walked the path of war, and now he walked the path of compromise, and both were full of thorns. And when the sun set over the low hills of Standing Rock, and the prairies stretched out golden and quiet beneath a sky full of stars, you could still see his figure in the dusk, broad-shouldered, unbending, shaped by storms, and still standing, because someone had to.
Gall had weathered every storm of bullets, of treaties, of broken promises, and still he stood with endurance. The warrior had become something more, a symbol of what it meant to carry a people forward when the ground beneath them was slipping away. But as fences tightened across the plains and the old songs grew faint, another wind began to rise. In our next and final episode, the story reaches its twilight. Old allies stand on opposite sides of a deepening divide. The agency grows uneasy, and for the man who stoked fear into the hearts of his enemies, the final chapter is not written in fire, but in silence, in shadows, and in the cost of everything left unsaid. As always, we've worked to stay true to the historical record, drawing from primary accounts, agency documents, and Lakota oral histories, while weaving in storytelling to bring the past to life with clarity and heart. If today's episode stirred something in you, if you learned something new or simply enjoyed the ride, please consider leaving us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening. It helps others discover the show and keeps these stories alive for future generations. We'll see you next time as we bring the saga of Gall to a close and bear witness to the last stand of a generation. This has been Chronicles of the Old West. Thanks for listening.